The night Caleb Reyes rode into Cedar Bend, the sky over the Montana plains was the color of a fresh bruise, and he had no way of knowing that within a week, he'd be standing in a parlor being offered a wife. But before the deal, before the desperate father and the trembling bride-to-be, there was a moment, small, easy to miss, that Caleb would later swear was the real beginning of everything. It happened at the well behind the Mercantile, 2 days after he'd taken a job breaking horses for the Whitfield ranch. She was drawing water, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair escaping its pins in the evening heat, and she didn't hear him approach until his shadow fell across the bucket. "Let me," he said, reaching for the rope before she could protest. She looked up at him, really looked, the way people rarely did with a stranger, and something in her expression shifted from wariness to something softer. "I've drawn my own water every day for 6 years, Mr. Reyes. Caleb Reyes." He hauled the bucket up with an ease that made it look like nothing, though the muscles in his forearms said otherwise. "And I don't doubt you've drawn plenty of water, Miss Whitfield. I'm just partial to good manners." Her name was Josephine Whitfield, and though Caleb didn't know it yet, she was the reason half the ranch hands went quiet whenever she walked past, not out of fear, but out of a respect edged with something warmer none of them dared name aloud. She was sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and had a laugh that came rarely enough that earning it felt like winning something. That evening at the well, Caleb earned it, once, over a clumsy joke about the horse he'd just failed to break, and he found himself thinking about that laugh long after he'd returned to the bunkhouse. He didn't know, not yet, that Josephine was 3 months pregnant, abandoned by the man who'd promised to marry her, and that her father was already making plans that would change both their lives. Elijah Whitfield was not a cruel man, but he was a desperate one, and desperation has a way of making good men do things they'd otherwise never consider. His daughter's condition had become the worst-kept secret in Cedar Bend. The father of the child, a traveling cattle buyer named Thomas Ashford, had ridden out of town the moment Josephine told him the news, leaving nothing behind but a trail of dust and a reputation now permanently attached to a woman who'd done nothing wrong except trust the wrong man. In 1880s Montana, an unmarried woman expecting a child faced consequences far beyond gossip. She could lose standing in the community, be barred from church functions, see doors closed that had once been open, and in Elijah's mind, worst of all, she could lose any chance at the kind of respectable future he'd hoped to give her. He'd already buried his wife 5 years earlier. He wasn't about to watch his daughter buried by the town's judgment too. So Elijah did the only thing his desperation could think to do. He looked for a man willing to marry her, quickly, quietly, and for a price substantial enough to make the arrangement worth the risk to his reputation. He found that man breaking horses in his own corral. 50 acres, Elijah said, standing in his study with his hands clasped behind his back like a man negotiating a cattle sale rather than his daughter's future. 50 acres of good grazing land, a cabin already built, and $200 besides. In exchange, you marry my daughter before the month is out, and you give the child your name. Caleb, hat in his hands, said nothing for a long moment. He thought of the well, of the laugh he'd earned, of a woman who deserved a great deal more than being handed off like a debt to be settled. "And what does Josephine say about this arrangement?" Caleb finally asked. Elijah blinked, as though the question hadn't occurred to him as particularly relevant. "She understands her situation." "That's not what I asked." Josephine's answer, when Caleb found her at the well again the next evening, was considerably less composed than her father's businesslike proposal. "I won't be bought and sold like a heifer at auction," she said, arms crossed tightly, eyes bright with the kind of anger that barely masked something more fragile underneath. "I don't care how much land my father's offering you, Mr. Reyes. I won't marry a man out of pity." "Good," Caleb said. "Because I wasn't planning on marrying you out of pity." That stopped her. Then why? He considered the question honestly before answering, because she deserved honesty more than she deserved a smooth answer. "I don't know you well, Miss Whitfield." "Not yet. But I know enough. I know you draw your own water and don't complain about the men who watch you do it. I know you laugh like it costs you something to give it away, which means it means something when you do. And I know a man left you alone to face something no person should face alone, and that's not a debt of yours to carry, it's his shame, not your burden. That's not an answer to why you'd marry me. No, he agreed. But it's an answer to why I don't think it'd be a mistake. He proposed, then, not as a business transaction but as an honest offer, marriage in name first, a fair partnership, no expectations beyond respect and honesty between them. If, in time, something more grew between them, he'd welcome it. If it never did, he'd still be a father to the child and a husband worth having, because that was the kind of man he intended to be regardless of what feelings did or didn't follow. Josephine, who had braced herself for pity or for a stranger's greed, found herself unable to find fault with an offer built on neither. They married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony that Cedar Bend gossiped about for exactly as long as it took for the next scandal to arrive. Elijah kept his word about the land and the cabin. Caleb kept his word about respect. What neither of them expected was how quickly respect turned into something else. It happened in small moments, the way real affection often does, nothing like the sudden, dramatic declarations Josephine had once foolishly believed love required. It was Caleb rising before dawn to have the cabin's fire lit and water warmed before she woke, so the Montana cold wouldn't bite at her in her condition. It was Josephine mending his shirts long after any obligation required it, humming while she worked, not noticing when he stood in the doorway just to watch her do it. It was late suppers where conversation stretched longer than necessary, and comfortable silences that felt less like emptiness and more like understanding. By the time their son was born on a snow-heavy February morning, Caleb Reyes was no longer a man fulfilling a bargain. He was a man who'd fallen entirely, quietly, and completely in love with his own wife, and terrified to admit it, for fear the arrangement between them had never been meant to hold real feeling. It was Josephine who said it first, 3 months after their son's birth, as they sat together on the cabin porch watching the spring thaw finally take hold of the mountains. "I used to think love had to announce itself," she said, not looking at him, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "Like a storm rolling in. I didn't expect it to arrive like this instead, quiet, and patient, and already here before I noticed it had come." Caleb turned to her, his heart in his throat in a way it hadn't been since the day Elijah Whitfield first offered him 50 acres and a stranger's hand in marriage. "Is that your way of telling me something, Josephine?" "It's my way of telling you I love you, Caleb Reyes. Not out of the bargain. Not out of gratitude. Just you." He didn't answer with words. He answered by taking her hand, the same hand that had once refused his help at a well out of pride, and holding it the way a man holds something he intends to keep for the rest of his life. The moral of the story. Love built on honesty and respect will always outlast love built on grand gestures and empty promises. Thomas Ashford offered Josephine passion and abandonment in the same breath. Caleb Reyes offered her nothing but honesty, patience, and steady kindness, and in doing so, gave her something far more lasting than the fleeting romance she'd once mistaken for love. True partnership isn't measured by how a relationship begins, but by the character of the person who chooses, every single day afterward, to show up for it. There's also a piece of real history worth understanding here. In the American West during the late 1800s, arranged and practical marriages, sometimes called marriages of convenience, were far more common than popular imagination often suggests. With homesteading laws requiring land to be actively worked and communities relying heavily on family units for survival, many marriages began as practical arrangements between near strangers. Historical records and letters from the era show that a surprising number of these unions grew into genuine, lifelong partnerships, proof that in the harsh, unpredictable landscape of the frontier, love often had less to do with how a couple began and everything to do with the choices they made together afterward. Josephine Reyes never forgot the lesson that porch conversation taught her. Love doesn't need to arrive like a storm to be real. Sometimes, the most lasting love arrives quietly, builds patiently, and stays, not because it was promised to, but because it chose to. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more whispers of the West, where every tale carries a little dust, a little heart, and a lesson worth riding home with.